Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Jason arrived at Five Poppies with the same calm exterior that had carried him through countless dangerous missions. But inside his chest his heart pounded with a storm of anticipation and dread. He knew the resort's polished veneer, the carefully maintained facade of elegance and luxury, was nothing but a mask. Beneath the marble floors and golden chandeliers lay corridors of secrets, laboratories of obsession, and the fingerprints of Caesar Fasin's legacy, a man who had always blurred the line between genius and madness. Jason carried himself with purpose, his eyes never lingering too long on the staff or the guests, his mind focused only on the clues Britt had left behind. Each step was heavy with memory. The name Britt alone had been enough to pull him back into the tangled web he had thought was closed forever. The trail led him through dimly lit hallways and back passages rarely visited by guests, places where the air smelled faintly of chemicals rather than perfume. When Jason reached Britt's former quarters, it was as though the walls still whispered her presence. Tucked away inside, carefully concealed behind a false panel in her desk, he found coded notes and fragmented directions. They spoke of a laboratory, of unfinished experiments, and of a truth so dangerous that she could not risk telling anyone outright. Jason pieced them together with meticulous patience, his pulse quickening with each confirmation that this path was real. It was more than just breadcrumbs, it was an invitation into a world he was never meant to see. The final steps took him to a sealed steel door deep beneath the resort, one that looked as if it belonged in a military bunker rather than a vacation paradise. The metal was reinforced, layered with bolts and a keypad that blinked with a cold and welcoming light. Jason knew immediately this was no ordinary lock. The codes were sophisticated, designed to keep intruders away and to protect something worth hiding at all costs. He drew in a slow breath, steadied his hands, and entered the sequence exactly as Britt's notes had instructed. For a moment the machine hesitated, and he felt the weight of years pressing down on him, as if the past itself was holding its breath. Then, with a low groan of gears, the heavy door began to slide open, and Jason found himself staring into the abyss. The laboratory stretched before him in a sterile glow, awash in fluorescent lights that made everything gleam too bright, too harsh. The air reeked of antiseptics and cold machinery, a far cry from the warmth of human presence. It was a place of science untethered from reality, where every sound echoed like a warning. Jason's eyes adjusted, scanning the room, until he saw the rows of glass chambers standing like silent sentinels. Each one pulsed faintly with a soft blue light, and within the viscous fluid inside floated human silhouettes suspended between life and death. As he approached, Jason's breath faltered. The closer he got, the clearer the outlines became, until recognition struck him with the force of a blow. There, preserved as though time itself had been reversed, was Britt. The face he had mourned, the eyes that had once looked at him with defiance and affection, were now closed in a deep slumber. Her body, once lifeless in his arms, now showed unmistakable signs of vitality, color in her skin, the faint rhythm of breath beneath the surface of the liquid. Jason's throat tightened, his heart breaking all over again, this time not from loss but from disbelief. The woman he had watched die was alive, or at least something close to it. The realization left him reeling. He pressed a hand against the glass, fighting the urge to collapse. How could this be possible? What twisted science had managed to steal Britt back from the finality of death? Every instinct screamed that this was wrong and natural, but his heart betrayed him with a dangerous flicker of hope. Then his gaze shifted, and he froze again as another form began to sharpen into focus in the chamber beside hers. It was Nathan. His features were unmistakable, strong jawline, the steady presence even in stillness. Nathan, who had fallen to Fasin's bullet, who had been mourned and buried, was here, suspended just like Britt. Jason's shock doubled, his mind unable to reconcile what he was seeing. He staggered back, pressing his spine against the cold wall as if trying to ground himself. Two people, both ripped away from the world, both returned in this grotesque resurrection. It wasn't just Britt. It wasn't a single anomaly. This was a pattern, a design. Fasin had not just cheated death once, he had mastered the art of rewriting its rules. Jason's pulse thundered as he looked between them. He wanted to rejoice at the sight of their faces, to believe that miracles were real, but the context poisoned everything. These weren't miracles. They were manufactured abominations born from obsession and control. He remembered Fasin's legacy, his hunger to defy mortality, his willingness to sacrifice humanity in pursuit of domination. If Britt and Nathan had been brought back, what were they now? Survivors, clones, or prisoners bound to someone else's will? Jason knew the answer was hidden in the data scattered across the lab files stacked neatly, the monitors flashing streams of genetic codes, the handwritten scrawls in a notebook that bore Fasin's name. The deeper Jason looked, the heavier the dread became. It wasn't just about reviving the dead, it was about reshaping them. Memories, instincts, loyalties, all could be altered. What he saw in those glass chambers might not be the Britt and Nathan he remembered. They could wake with fractured minds, or worse, programmed to serve as weapons against those they once loved. That realization hit Jason harder than any bullet. If they opened their eyes, would they recognize him? Or would they see him as the enemy? Standing in that sterile room, Jason felt as though he had uncovered a secret too large for one man to bear. He had found hope twisted into horror, love resurrected into uncertainty, and proof that the past was far from buried. The sight of Britt and Nathan, alive yet not truly free, was the most profound shock of his life. And as the machines hummed softly around him, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: this discovery would change everything, not just for him, but for Port Charles and everyone who dared to stand against the shadows of Fasin's legacy. Nathan, the man whose life had been stolen by Fasin's bullet, was now lying in that chamber, suspended in an eerie stillness that was neither death nor life. His face, once warm with kindness and strength, now appeared pale and waxen beneath the glow of the liquid that kept him preserved. His eyes remained closed, as though he were locked in an endless slumber, shielded by the artificial mechanisms that sustained him. To Jason, it was a vision that shattered the boundaries of reality. Nathan was not just a colleague or a figure from Port Charles' past, had been a friend, a man who had sacrificed himself for those he loved. And above all, Nathan had been Maxie's anchor, her greatest heartbreak, and the father figure she had clung to even in his absence. Seeing him now, caught in this liminal space, was like reopening every wound that had never truly healed. Jason's stomach twisted as he watched the chamber glow faintly around Nathan's body. The thought of Maxie pierced him like a blade. She had carried her grief for years, raising her daughter with a mixture of resilience and sorrow, never fully recovering from the hole Nathan's death had left in her life. What would it do to her if she knew he had been here all along, hidden away in this tomb of science, reduced to nothing more than a specimen in Fasin's grotesque experiment? The cruelty of it was almost unbearable, as though Fasin's hand continued to stretch beyond the grave, tormenting those who had already suffered enough. The reality bore down on Jason with suffocating weight. It wasn't just Britt, it was Nathan too. Their dual resurrection was not a miracle, it was a signal. A signal that Fasin's reach had extended further than anyone had dared to imagine. Jason's mind raced, recalling every battle he had fought against Fasin, every trap, every manipulation. The man had always operated from the shadows, a spider weaving webs too intricate to unravel until it was too late. What if death had only been another one of Fasin's illusions? What if these resurrections were not acts of mercy but carefully laid foundations for a new empire of control? Jason felt his pulse quicken as the terrifying implications unfolded. Britt and Nathan's lives had been stolen, their deaths mourned, their memories cherished. Now, with their bodies revived through some unholy science, Jason could not escape the darker question: what else had been altered? Were they truly themselves, the same people they had once been, or were they reconstructed shells, stripped of free will and rewritten to serve the very man who had destroyed them? Jason imagined the moment their eyes might open. Would they look at him with recognition, gratitude, and humanity, or would they look at him as enemies programmed to eliminate? The thought chilled him to the bone. The idea of Maxie embracing Nathan again, only to discover he was no longer the man she had loved, was unbearable. The vision of Britt walking back into Port Charles, her presence both a comfort and a curse, weighed heavily on him. Their existence, brought back through methods no human should have the power to control, felt less like a blessing and more like a curse carefully disguised as salvation. Jason stood rooted in place, his muscles tense but his body unwilling to move, as though frozen between hope and dread. His heart longed to believe in the possibility of their return, but his instincts screamed that this was something far darker. The phrase twin miracle echoed in his mind, not as a promise of joy but as a dire omen. If Caesar Fasin had engineered this, then their deaths had never been the end, they had only been the prologue to a more sinister chapter. Their resurrection was not a gift, it was a weapon forged in secret, waiting for the moment to be unleashed. For Jason, the revelation was devastating. He had seen death countless times, had carried the weight of lives lost, and had learned to live with the permanence of loss. But this was different. It violated the natural order, distorted grief, and transformed memory into a battlefield. Britt and Nathan, once symbols of love and sacrifice, had been stolen again, returned not as themselves but as pawns in a legacy of horror. Jason's breath came shallow and ragged as he realized the truth. Every resurrection bore a shadow. Each life reclaimed carried with it a darkness that could not be ignored. The sight of them left Jason shaken to his core, his faith in reality fractured. What lay before him was not hope, but a warning, a haunting reminder that death was no longer the final boundary in Fasin's twisted vision. If the dead could be made to live again, they could also be twisted into something else entirely. And Jason knew, with grim certainty, that this revelation would not remain hidden for long. Once unleashed, the consequences would ripple through Port Charles, tearing at the fragile bonds of love, loyalty, and truth until nothing remained untouched. Jason's chest tightened as the mechanical hum of the laboratory deepened, vibrating through the sterile metal floors beneath his boots. The faint rhythm of the artificial heartbeat seemed to grow louder with every passing second, not just in the air around him but in his own body, sensing cruelly with the rapid pounding of his heart. He forced himself to take a steadying breath, though it felt thin, useless, against the oppressive weight of what stood before him. His eyes roamed over the files once more, then to the chambers, then back to the blinking monitors that chronicled every detail of Britt and Nathan's manufactured survival. The entire place felt alive, as though the laboratory itself was holding its breath in anticipation of his next move. He leaned over the nearest desk, pulling closer one of the handwritten journals that carried Fasin's unmistakable signature. The paper was worn, edges curling, but the words etched into it carried a malevolent permanence. Jason traced the jagged ink with his gloved finger, reading passages that described the process of preserving neural pathways, the injection of compounds to stimulate dormant synapses, and the gradual layering of memories like paint applied stroke by stroke until a new consciousness took shape. The arrogance was palpable. Fasin hadn't just sought to preserve life, he had sought to reinvent it, twisting biology into his own design. Each note revealed the man's hunger for power disguised as scientific discovery. Jason could almost hear his mocking voice behind the words, whispering that he had found a way to make death meaningless, to enslave even those who had once defied him. Jason slammed the journal shut, his jaw tight with rage and despair. He had thought Fasin's reign of terror had ended years ago, buried with him, but this laboratory was proof that his influence lingered like a rot that refused to die. These chambers, these bodies, these heartbeats weren't miracles. They were shackles forged in glass and steel, chains that could bind not just Britt and Nathan but anyone unlucky enough to fall into Fasin's grasp. Jason stared at their faces through the distortion of the liquid. Britt looked serene, almost peaceful, as though she were simply sleeping. Nathan's expression was calmer still, but that calmness was unnatural, too still, as if it had been crafted. Jason's gut churned with doubt. Was this really them? Or were they copies wearing familiar faces? The monitors on the far wall flickered, streams of data cascading down in green and red. Jason's eyes caught on the neural activity displayed for Nathan, pulses of light, bursts of signals that mirrored the rhythms of a conscious brain. Next to it, Britt's vitals climbed, her oxygen levels stabilizing as though her body were preparing itself to wake. Jason swallowed hard. They were close, so close to the edge of revival that it might only take one command, one sequence entered into the console, to release them from their prisons. He stood frozen, torn between two impossible choices. A part of him wanted to believe. He wanted to believe that Britt, who had died in his arms, who had been taken from him in the most agonizing way, could walk again, breathe again, smile again. He wanted to believe that Nathan, whose death had carved a permanent scar in Maxie's life, could return to his family and give her back the love she had lost. For one fleeting moment, Jason allowed himself to imagine it, Britt walking into Port Charles, alive against all odds, Nathan reuniting with Maxie and their daughter. The thought was powerful, intoxicating, like the cruelest form of hope. But the darker part of Jason's mind screamed louder. He remembered Fasin's games, his manipulations, the way he had twisted every weakness into a weapon. He remembered how many lives had been destroyed in the pursuit of his obsessions. This was not salvation. It was a trap. Britt and Nathan might wake, yes. But what would wake inside them? Would it be the people Jason once knew, or vessels rewritten to serve a dead man's will? What if their memories were fractured, reshaped, their loyalty not to their loved ones but to the one who had orchestrated their return? Jason imagined Britt's eyes opening, not with warmth, but with cold obedience. He pictured Nathan standing tall, but not as Maxie's protector, rather as Fasin's enforcer. The thought sent a shiver through his entire body. Jason's fists clenched at his sides, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical force. He knew he couldn't stay here forever, paralyzed by fear and longing. Every second that passed felt like an invitation for disaster, as if the laboratory itself was daring him to act. He turned his gaze back to the piles of files, knowing Anna would want to see them, knowing she would dig until she uncovered the entire truth. He respected her determination, but he also feared it. Anna's pursuit of justice had always driven her straight into danger, and if she discovered the resurrection of Britt and Nathan, she would not stop until she dismantled every piece of Fasin's work. That path could cost her everything. The machines hummed louder, the chambers bubbling faintly as though responding to his indecision. Jason's breathing quickened. He stood between two future zones where he opened the chambers and unleashed something he might not be able to control, and one where he destroyed them, ending this nightmare before it could begin but erasing the chance of saving Britt and Nathan forever. His throat tightened, the ache of grief rising once more. Was it mercy to let them rest in peace, or was it betrayal to deny them a second chance? The weight of that question threatened to crush him. Jason stepped forward, his hand hovering above the console that would initiate the release. He could almost feel Britt's presence urging him, Nathan's steady voice reminding him of loyalty and sacrifice. Yet beneath it all lurked the shadow of Fasin, grinning from beyond the grave, reveling in the torment his work continued to cause. Jason's hand shook. He pulled back, then pressed closer again, trapped in a cycle of hesitation. He glanced at the monitors once more. Their heartbeats were steady, strong. They were alive, or at least something close to it. The choice burned in his chest, to embrace the impossible or to end the threat before it could rise. His silence was filled with the rhythmic beep of the machines, a sound that might have been hope or might have been doom. Either way, Jason knew that whatever decision he made here, alone in this hidden chamber, would echo far beyond these walls. It would reach Anna, Maxie, and everyone in Port Charles. And it would change their lives forever. Jason moved further from the underground lab, but every step seemed heavier than the last, as if the walls of Five Poppies still clung to him, pulling him back toward the truth he wished he could unlearn. The night air was cool against his face, yet it did nothing to calm the fire that burned in his chest. His mind was a battlefield, torn between the relief of seeing Britt and Nathan alive, and the dread of realizing that what he had seen was not life in the way he understood it. The images of their still forms floated in his mind relentlessly, Britt's face peaceful in its artificial slumber, Nathan's body preserved as though time had frozen around him. They should not exist in this state. Death had claimed them, but death had been cheated, then redefined into something unrecognizable. That thought gnawed at Jason like a splinter buried too deep to remove. The path before him was quiet, but his senses were alive, sharpened by adrenaline. He glanced behind him, half expecting the ground to split open and release the horrors he had left behind. It felt impossible that such a grotesque secret could remain hidden for long. The machines were running, the monitors alive with data, and Britt and Nathan's vitals pulsing with undeniable life. It was as though the lab itself had awakened because he had found it, and now it would not rest until its purpose was fulfilled. Jason pressed his lips together in grim silence. He had witnessed countless betrayals, fought enemies who twisted morality into ash, but this was different. This was not just war or crime. This was war against the very laws of existence. He thought of Maxie. The weight of her grief had always been visible, a shadow that never left her eyes. Nathan's death had carved into her, forcing her to rebuild her life around an absence that could never truly be filled. And Britt, their complicated, stormy presence had left Jason with more questions than answers even when she was alive. He had mourned her death, carried guilt for being unable to save her. What right did he have now, seeing them alive in that twisted laboratory, to keep the truth from Maxie, from everyone? Yet, what right did he have to reveal it? If he told Maxie that Nathan was alive, she would run to him without hesitation. But would she find the Nathan she remembered, or a stranger with his face, his voice, his memories rearranged like pieces of a puzzle forced into the wrong shape? The cruelty of that possibility made Jason's chest tighten until he thought he couldn't breathe. The stars overhead seemed indifferent, silent witnesses to a man carrying a secret that could shatter an entire city. Jason paused, resting a hand on the trunk of a tree at the edge of the property. His mind returned to the files pages filled with Fasin's handwriting, diagrams, equations, notes about memory reconstruction, and cellular manipulation. The language had been cold, clinical, but the intent had been unmistakably sadistic. Fasin had not only wanted to conquer death, he had wanted to bend it into a weapon. Jason had seen soldiers built from broken men before, but this was worse. This was resurrection turned into servitude, life turned into chains. Britt and Nathan were not saved. They were stolen, their bodies hijacked, their futures corrupted by a man who had delighted in tormenting everyone he touched. Jason's thoughts spiraled further. What if Britt and Nathan were only the beginning? The facility was large, its design suggesting that multiple chambers could be filled. What if there were others' faces Jason and Anna both had buried, names etched into Port Charles' tragic history? Could Lulu lie hidden in one of those tanks, or Morgan, or anyone else lost to the cruelty of fate? The thought made Jason's skin crawl. The lab was more than a tomb, it was a vault of nightmares waiting to be opened. And if the wrong hands found it, if those experiments were replicated or unleashed, Port Charles would not just face grief, it would face chaos unlike anything before. His boots crunched against the gravel path, each sound grounding him in reality. But the weight of what he carried threatened to crush him all the same. Jason had always been a man of action, someone who met threats with decisiveness and precision. But here, there was no clear shot, no simple strike to end the danger. Destroying the lab would mean destroying Britt and Nathan, condemning them to death a second time. But leaving it intact risked unleashing something far worse. He could see Anna's face in his mind, stern and determined, her instincts honed to uncover the truth no matter the cost. If she knew, she would chase it until the end, and Jason wasn't sure the end would be survivable. And then there was his own heart, traitorous in its longing. A part of him wanted Britt back, not the science experiment lying in that chamber, but the woman who had fought beside him, who had challenged him, who had shared fleeting moments of vulnerability with him. He wanted her laughter, her fire, her humanity. Seeing her alive again had sparked something he had buried, a dangerous flame of hope. But hope in this place was poison. Hope blinded men to the traps laid before them, and Fasin's traps had always been crueler than anyone could imagine. By the time Jason reached the outer wall of the property, he knew one thing with chilling certainty: he had opened a door that could never be closed again. The truth was out there now, carried in his memory, in the files he had seen, in the monitors still running beneath the ground. Poor Charles would one day face the consequences of what he had discovered, whether he spoke of it or not. He could burn the lab, bury the evidence, and yet the knowledge that resurrection was possible would haunt him, gnaw at him, whisper to him that somewhere, someone might already be repeating Fasin's work. Jason stopped, his gaze hardening as he looked back one last time at the resort glowing faintly in the distance. To the world, Five Poppies remained a place of decadence and beauty. To him, it was now the cradle of a nightmare. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his shoulders, and walked into the darkness, the weight of his secret pressing down with every step. Somewhere in his gut, he understood that his life, Anna's, Maxie's, and perhaps the entire fabric of Port Charles had just shifted. Britt and Nathan's return was not the end of grief, but the beginning of something far more dangerous. In the deepest recesses of his mind, Jason admitted what he could not say aloud. He had looked upon death defeated, and what he saw was not salvation. It was the beginning of a new war, one against forces that did not belong to the world of the living or the dead. And no matter how far he walked from that lab, the echoes of the heartbeats he had heard would follow him forever, a reminder that some doors, once opened, change everything.